I want to start today with a story about a quirky religious group out of Salt Lake City, the Summum. Now, the Summum are a small group on the western side of Salt Lake City on a large piece of property with a pyramid on it that opens up like a DeLorean. People can go inside and do rituals. There are mummies in there, real, actual mummies. The Summum were founded in 1975 when an administrative manager from a Salt Lake City supply company was visited by superior beings from another planet who presented him with the 7 aphorisms of the Summum. The Summum believed that when Moses went to the top of Mount Sinai, God gave him the 7 aphorisms first, but then when Moses went down and saw the people and he saw the immaturity of the people, they weren't ready for the 7 aphorisms, so he smashed the 7 aphorisms, went back to the top of the mountain, got the 10 commandments, and gave it to the people instead. Not so far from Salt Lake City is this small town called Pleasant Grove. And within Pleasant Grove, there's a public park, and inside that public park, there's a monument to the 10 Commandments. When you might say to yourself, well, how could there be a giant monument to the 10 Commandments in a public park, given that we have separation of church and state? To which I would say, I agree. But the Supreme Court disagreed, and in 2005, they somehow held, in this case called Van Orden, that the government may have a 10 Commandments monument on its property so long as the monument is surrounded by some other monuments and so long as the monument's been there for a long time. Well, the Summum, being a group that believes in religious pluralism, went and they thought, hey, if this park has a 10 Commandments monument in it, shouldn't it also have a 7 aphorisms monument in it? And so they asked the town, they said, we would like to put up our 7 aphorisms monument in your park. Shockingly, the park said, no, thank you. They said, the 10 Commandments are okay because they're related to the history of the United States and the history of Pleasant Grove, but the 7 aphorisms, not so much. So the Summum sued. They sued for religious discrimination, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held 9-0 against the Summum. And the reasoning was that when the government puts up a monument on its property, it's basically speaking for itself. And so you can't come in and tell the government that it's got to say something that it doesn't agree with, which actually makes a lot of sense. If it was otherwise, then if the government were to, for example, put up a monument to liberty and equality, somebody could come and say, hey, you got to put up my monument to bondage and slavery, and we wouldn't obviously want that. So the Summum rightfully lost, although the problem in that whole situation is not with the Summum case, it's with the 10 Commandments case, in my view. But in any event, the Summum situation illustrates 2 interesting things about the United States at the current moment. The first is that we don't really live in a separation of church and state nation. Over the course of the last 20 or 25 years, the Supreme Court has basically torn down the wall between the separation of church and state, and it's upheld all sorts of government support of religion, from putting up religious monuments to giving out government money to religious organizations, and so many other things. I don't know if we've ever actually lived in a society that had separation of church and state, but if we did, we currently live in a post-separation of church and state nation. The second thing that the Summum case illustrates is how religiously diverse the United States has become. So as recently as 1970, about 90% of Americans identified as Christian. Now that's much lower, something like 70%. And there are 2 reasons for that. One is the rise in minority religions like the Summum, but also many others, of course. And the other reason is because of the nones, the N-O-N-E-S, nuns, people who don't believe in any particular religion at all, and they have risen in number. They're something like 20, 25, 30% of the population. So those 2 facts, if you put them together, they raise the question in my mind, what should non-Christians do in a post-separation of church and state nation? And I think there are 3 possibilities. One is they could continue to fight in the courts for separation of church and state. Now, when I was first working on my book, Our Non-Christian Nation, of which this talk is a sort of it kind of derives from, this was a possibility because Hillary Clinton was running for president, and it looked like she was going to win. And if she had won, she would have appointed liberals to the Supreme Court who would have gone back maybe to the separation of church and state. But you may not know this. Hillary Clinton lost, and Donald Trump became the president, and then we got Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, and so we're not going anywhere near separation of church and state anytime soon. So that leaves two possibilities. One is that the non-Christians, the religious minorities, basically do nothing and allow the public square to be dominated by the majority religion, Christianity. The second possibility, though, is that maybe the religious minorities, the non-Christians, should say, hey, those cases the Supreme Court decided apply to us too, and so we should be participating in public life alongside the Christian majority. So now I want to tell you two stories. If you are buried in a national cemetery, you can have the symbol, religious symbol of your choice put on the National Cemetery headstone, as long as the Veterans Administration has approved that symbol. So I don't know if you know this, but there are a lot of Wiccans in the American military. And about 12 years ago or so, a Wiccan died when his helicopter was shot down in Afghanistan. And his wife, not surprisingly, wanted to have a Wiccan pentacle placed on the headstone. Except that the Wiccan pentacle wasn't on the list of approved symbols. So she asked the VA, she said, can you please approve the Wiccan pentacle? And she wasn't the first person to have done this. Other Wiccans had done this in the past. And every time the VA just sort of ignored them. Well, they gave them a runaround. They said, yeah, we're thinking about that. File this other application, something like that. Eventually, the Wiccans just got fed up. So they went and they hired Americans United for Separation of Church and State and brought a lawsuit claiming religious discrimination. Now, in the discovery part of that lawsuit, the lawyers discovered a paper trail that basically showed that the reason why the VA did not approve of the Wiccan pentacle was because they didn't like witches. And in fact, this went all the way to the top. When George W. Bush was running for president, he was asked on Good Morning America about this incident that had just happened at Fort Hood where a coven of Wiccans had done a prayer circle. And George Bush said, I don't believe witchcraft is a religion. I wish that the military would check this out again and come to a different conclusion. Something like that. So then, by then it was clear that the government was discriminating against Wiccans, and so the government settled. And they approved the Wiccan pentacle. And now there are at least 8 Wiccans who are buried in the National Cemetery who have a Wiccan pentacle on their headstone. And in fact, every year, on Memorial Day, this small group of Wiccans from the Northern Virginia area goes from grave to grave and does a ritual to thank those Wiccans for their service. And a postscript to that story is that after this all happened, the VA changed its rules entirely about how it was going to approve symbols to put it on the headstones. They basically said anything that fits will approve at this point. And so now, in the recent years, they've approved the Druid Awen, they've approved the Hammer of Thor, they've approved just this simple heart. I keep waiting for the flying spaghetti monsters, people to ask for a meatball, but that hasn't happened yet. Anyways, that's the first story. The second story comes from Phoenix, Arizona. The City Council of Phoenix, like many other city councils and town boards around the country, used to start its every meeting with a prayer, which the Supreme Court in 2014 said was fine. In a case called Town of Greece versus Galloway, the Supreme Court said it's okay for a town board meeting to start with a prayer, even if that prayer is completely sectarian to Jesus Christ, our Savior, and even if there are people in the audience who might feel coerced into participating in the prayer because, for example, they might have a zoning variance coming up in like 10 minutes before the board. So the Supreme Court said that was okay. But at the same time, they also said that the government cannot discriminate on the basis of religion when they decide who to invite or who to allow to give the invocation. So as a result, right after the decision came down, atheists and Wiccans and Muslims and Hindus and all sorts of other minority religions asked city councils and town boards and legislatures across the country if they could give invocations, and they were allowed to. And it's interesting to see what happens when there's a minority who gives an invocation. Oftentimes, it's very controversial. There have been protests. There have been people shouted down while they were trying to pray. Members of the town board have turned their backs and walked out of the room and given a counter prayer, at least in one example. Other times, nothing happens and everything goes well. For example, when I was researching our non-Christian nation, I went to Town of Greece, and I watched Linda Stevens, who is an atheist, give a secular invocation before the very board that she had just sued. And there was no incident whatsoever. I was kind of hoping that something would happen, but nothing happened. I mean, there was a guy sitting right next to me who took off his hat when the head of the town board said we're going to have a prayer, and then halfway through, when he realized it wasn't really a prayer, he put his hat back on. But other than that, nothing happened. If you want to see something happen, though, what you do is you go find out what happens when the Satanic Temple shows up. The Satanic Temple is a group that was formed in 2012 and now counts maybe 50,000 members across the globe. That might be a little high. They have a big membership, though. And this group is not your grandma's Satanists. Okay? They don't kill babies or drink blood or mutilate cats. And in fact, nobody has ever done that. No satanic group has ever done it. That is all made up by the satanic panic of the 1970s and 1980s. Anyways, what the Satanic Temple does believe is they believe in venerating the symbol of Satan as a rebellion against oppressive authority. And as a result, they do rituals about that, they make art about that, they discuss Satanist theology in theological groups, etc. They also do things like they collect socks for the homeless, and they clean up highways, all sorts of like evil things like that. They're a very politically left-leaning group. They make Bernie Sanders look like Joe Lieberman, as I think. That's what I say. So the Satanic Temple, but what they're really known for, what people have heard about them, is that they really believe in the separation of church and state. And so if the government is supporting Christianity somewhere, they will often show up and say, well, you have to support Satanism too. So, for example, when Arkansas put up a Ten Commandments monument, the Satanic Temple asked Arkansas to also put up their 9-foot bronze monument to Baphomet, this goat-headed occult figure. Arkansas did not do that, and so there's a lawsuit going on about that. When the Christian Evangelical Fellowship starts good news clubs in public schools after the school day is done, they use classrooms around the school in order to proselytize 6-year-olds into believing the literal truth of the Bible. The Satanic Temple asked them to also host their after-school Satan group, or ASS group, in order to spread the word of Satan to the students as well. Now, a couple of Satanists in Phoenix said, we'd like to give the invocation. And the city of Phoenix said, okay, we have to let you, because that's the rule. But as the time approached for the invocation and the people of Phoenix found out what was going on, they went bananas. And they had held this giant meeting with like 300 people. It went on for an hour. Everybody denounced the Satanic Temple, even though it was clear that nobody knew what they were about. People said, we got to protect Phoenix from Satan. Satan's going to bring his curses upon our town. They took out dollar bills to prove that we were one nation under God, et cetera, et cetera. It went on and on. And what did the city council do? It canceled the invocation program altogether and replaced it with a moment of silence. So now nobody's giving an invocation in Phoenix, Christians, Wiccans, certainly not Satanists. So what do we learn from these two stories? One thing we learn is that, in fact, non-Christians have been demanding to take part in public life alongside Christians. This has happened a lot. It's sort of increasing over the last few years. They're asking to give invocations, to get government money, to start after-school clubs and the like. For somebody like me who grew up Jewish and then became an atheist and then got really into Taoism, this is kind of an exciting phenomenon to study and follow. The other thing that we learn, which is more important, is what happens when the minority asks to participate in public life. There are two possibilities. Actually, the Summum example presents a third possibility, but that's sort of anomalous, and it turns on the fact that Van Orden Ten Commandments case was so stupid. But other than that, there are two things that usually happen. One is the Christians say, oh, sure, come on, and we'll have and either they decide to let non-Christians into the public square, or they're forced to by the courts, and then we have a more pluralistic public square. Think about the National Cemetery with its Wiccan pentacles and its Jewish stars and the crosses and everything like that, the meatball possibly. Or do you think about the invocation, in town of Greece, where the atheists are giving invocations after Christians? The second possibility is that the Christian majority doesn't want them to share the stage with minorities, and so closes down the forum altogether to religion. I think that either of those two possibilities is preferable to a public square that is dominated by Christianity. And so if you zip back to the question I asked before, which is what should non-Christians do in a post-separation of church and state society, and remember there were two possibilities, either do nothing and cede the public square to the religious majority, or seek to participate alongside the majority. I think either of those things are better than I mean, I think if you that participating, demanding participation alongside Christians is much better than ceding the public square to the majority, and that's because either a secular public square or a pluralistic public square is better than a public square dominated by one religion. A secular public square is one where we have separation of church and state. It's a separationist's dream. Government and religion are largely separate. Government can't support majority religion and denigrate minority religions or interfere with the religions. But a pluralistic public square, you know, all sorts of religious people saying what they think and non-religious people saying what they think all together, a religious cacophony, if you will, that to me is not as good as a secular public square, but I think it's a lot better than a public square that's dominated by one religious faith. And that's the question, isn't it? Do we want a religiously pluralistic public square or a public square dominated by one religion? And I think if you believe in pluralism at all, if you think pluralism is a good value, then that's a question that answers itself. And that's why I've argued that non-Christians, atheists, Satanists, Wiccans, and others need to continue to demand their rightful place in American public life. Thank you very much.